The courtroom buzzed with quiet laughter as a 17-year-old girl stepped forward to the defense table, standing confidently in front of a skeptical judge. "What are you doing in my courtroom, little girl? This isn't a school playground," the judge said mockingly, drawing more chuckles from the crowd. But the young girl didn't flinch. Her name was Aaliyah Carter, a prodigy with an IQ of 160 who graduated high school at 13 and law school by 16. Despite her credentials, no one in the courtroom believed she belonged there. The prosecutor scoffed, spectators whispered insults, and even the clerk doubted her presence. But Aaliyah calmly opened her briefcase, pulled out her documents, and began to speak. With confidence and clarity, she cited the exact law that proved her client's arrest was unconstitutional. Within minutes, she exposed multiple flaws in the prosecution's case: misfiled evidence, unreliable witnesses, and a questionable arrest report. The judge who had mocked her was now leaning forward in stunned silence. The prosecutor, once arrogant, looked pale and speechless. As Aaliyah finished her defense, the entire courtroom sat in silence before erupting into applause. The judge stood and admitted, "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology. I underestimated you." The client hugged Aaliyah with tears in their eyes, and even the skeptical clerk muttered, "She's a legend." Aaliyah didn't just win a case, she shattered stereotypes about age, race, and brilliance. She proved that greatness isn't defined by how old you are or what you look like, but by how hard you work and how fearlessly you stand in your truth. In a world quick to judge, Aaliyah reminded everyone, never underestimate someone who knows their worth. She didn't need approval, only a chance to speak, and she made every second count. The courtroom was unusually full that morning, the air charged with quiet curiosity. Everyone had heard rumors that a teenager would be defending a real case, an actual client facing serious charges. Whispers circulated like wildfire as people shuffled to their seats, exchanging skeptical glances and snickers. Then the door opened, and in walked a 17-year-old black girl dressed in a perfectly fitted navy blue suit, her hair neatly tied back, a leather briefcase in hand. She walked to the defense table with calm, purposeful steps, her expression unreadable, her presence quiet yet commanding. The judge looked up, blinked once, then narrowed his eyes and leaned forward. "What are you doing in my courtroom, little girl? This isn't a school playground," he said, his voice laced with condescension, his lips curling into a smirk that set off a ripple of chuckles across the courtroom. The prosecutor laughed under his breath, shaking his head as if this was all some kind of joke. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, unsure if this was real or some elaborate prank. Spectators whispered among themselves, snide comments floating through the room. "Is this some school project? Where are her parents? This has to be illegal." The court clerk, who had seen hundreds of cases, leaned over to a colleague and muttered, "Why would anyone let a kid pretend to be a lawyer?" But the girl remained silent. Her name was Aaliyah Carter, and what they didn't know, what none of them even bothered to check, was who she really was. Aaliyah was no ordinary teenager. She was a genius with an IQ of 160, homeschooled by parents who saw her potential early on. She had completed high school by the time she was 13, taken the LSAT at 14, entered law school shortly after, and graduated with honors at 16. Under a rare state-supervised prodigy program designed for gifted individuals, Aaliyah had been granted legal permission to represent clients in court under mentorship. This was not a stunt. This was her dream. Still, as she stood in that courtroom, all that brilliance was invisible to the people around her. They saw only her age, her skin color, her gender, and they assumed weakness, naivety, inexperience. But they were wrong. So very wrong. Aaliyah opened her briefcase slowly, her fingers steady as they moved over the case files. She laid them out neatly before her, adjusted the microphone, and waited patiently as the judge settled the courtroom. Her client, a young man in his 20s, falsely accused of assault, looked over at her nervously, unsure himself of what was about to happen. She gave him a quick, reassuring glance and a nod. It was time. The prosecution opened as expected. Smug, loud, and completely dismissive, the district attorney used every opportunity to mock Aaliyah's age. "Let's hope the defense doesn't turn this into a high school debate club," he joked to the gallery. Laughter followed, but Aaliyah said nothing. She waited, and when it was finally her turn, she stood up and spoke, not like a teenager, not like someone pretending, but like a seasoned professional. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and firm, "before we proceed, I'd like to file a motion to dismiss this case on the grounds of unlawful arrest. Under Section 48B of the State Penal Code, my client's arrest violated due process, as there was no warrant issued, and the search of his residence was conducted without consent or probable cause." The room fell into sudden silence. The judge stared. The prosecutor froze, blinking rapidly. The clerk leaned forward in surprise. Everyone had expected her to stumble. Instead, she struck like lightning. Over the next 20 minutes, Aaliyah broke down the entire case with laser precision. She highlighted discrepancies in the arresting officer's report, showed time-stamped video evidence proving her client's alibi, and even presented an expert testimony, pre-recorded via affidavit, disputing the prosecution's primary forensic claim. Her questions during cross-examination were sharp, strategic, and unrelenting. Witnesses who had once seemed confident began to falter under her scrutiny. The judge, who had mocked her just an hour before, now leaned forward, furrowing his brows, listening intently to every word. The prosecutor attempted to object multiple times, each time grasping at straws. Aaliyah countered every single one with textbook accuracy and case law references. Her knowledge was not just impressive, it was undeniable. And slowly, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The smirks disappeared. The whispers stopped. Spectators now watched her in awe. By the time she concluded her final statement, "In a just system, it is not age that determines credibility, but truth. And the truth is, my client is innocent." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The judge sat back, silent for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "I must admit I underestimated you, and that was my mistake." The courtroom erupted into spontaneous applause. Her client broke down in tears and embraced her. Reporters who had come for a spectacle were now scribbling headlines like "Teen Legal Prodigy Stuns Courtroom." Even, the once doubtful clerk whispered, "She's a legend." But for Aaliyah, this moment wasn't about applause or validation. It was about justice. She had watched people who looked like her, young, black, brilliant, be ignored, mocked, pushed aside. She had seen society label them as troublemakers, not trailblazers. And she had promised herself that one day she would make them see. She didn't want pity. She didn't want favors. She just wanted a fair chance. And she had taken it. Her victory that day was more than just a legal win. It was a cultural statement. A statement that brilliance comes in many forms, that talent has no age, that you cannot judge someone's worth by the way they look or how young they are. It was a wake-up call to everyone in that room and to everyone who would hear her story later, that bias is blindness. And underestimating someone because of who they appear to be is the fastest way to be proven wrong. As she walked out of the courtroom, reporters called out to her. Cameras flashed. Her story went viral. Social media flooded with praise, admiration, and disbelief. But through it all, Aaliyah stayed grounded. She returned to her studies, continued working cases under supervision, and never let fame distract her from the mission to serve justice with excellence. Later that evening, as she sat quietly in her room reviewing notes for her next case, her mother walked in and hugged her tightly. "You made history today," she whispered. But Aaliyah simply smiled and replied, "I just did what was right." And that is the real power of her story. Not just that she was a genius attorney in disguise, but that she stood in the face of disrespect, discrimination, and doubt, and still let her brilliance shine. She didn't fight back with anger. She didn't demand validation. She let her knowledge, preparation, and passion speak for her. And in doing so, she turned a courtroom full of doubters into believers. She reminded the world that greatness doesn't come wrapped in a certain package. It comes from courage, preparation, and the refusal to stay silent. In the end, Aaliyah Carter didn't just defend a client. She defended the future, one where young people, especially girls of color, are seen for who they are, not who others assume them to be. A world where genius isn't mocked, but celebrated. A world where voices like hers are no longer underestimated, but heard. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as a young black girl, no older than 17, stepped forward and took her place at the defense table. She wore a sleek, professional black suit, her natural curls neatly tied back, her face calm but determined. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Is this some kind of mock trial?" he scoffed, barely concealing a grin. A few people in the gallery chuckled, while the prosecutor smirked, whispering something under his breath to a colleague. The bailiff tried to hide a laugh, but the girl stood still, eyes fixed on the bench, unbothered by the whispers or the laughter. Her name was Aaliyah Carter, and although almost everyone in that courtroom saw her as nothing more than a child playing dress-up, she was about to turn the entire room upside down. The case seemed simple to the prosecution. A young man accused of theft, caught on camera with 2 eyewitnesses. An open and shut case. They barely prepared. But Aaliyah had spent months reviewing every document, frame of footage, and legal precedent. With an IQ of 160, she wasn't just smart, she was exceptional. She'd graduated high school at 13, earned her law degree by 16, and now, under a rare but legal state program that permitted gifted minors to represent clients under special supervision, she was here to prove something far greater than her intellect. She was here to prove that justice doesn't come with age or appearance. It comes with truth. As the judge leaned back in his chair, still unimpressed, the prosecutor stood and began his opening statement, painting Aaliyah's client as a career criminal. He was loud, confident, and, in his mind, untouchable. When it was Aaliyah's turn, she didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped forward, opened her sleek black briefcase, and pulled out her notes. The room fell into a hush. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong, "may I remind the court that under Section 48B of the State Penal Code, my client's arrest was unconstitutional." You could hear a pin drop. The judge's smirk vanished. He blinked, leaned forward, and narrowed his eyes at the girl standing before him. "Explain," he said, and she did. In the next 10 minutes, Aaliyah presented legal precedent, cited 2 federal cases and 1 state amendment that showed the arresting officer had no probable cause. She exposed how the arresting officer had manipulated evidence and violated Miranda rights. As she continued, her voice steady and composed, the prosecutor's face grew pale. The judge glanced at the court reporter to make sure it was all on record. The murmurs from the gallery had turned to stunned silence. No one was laughing now. Then came the cross-examination. Aaliyah stood no taller than 5'3", but her questions hit like thunder. "Officer Jenkins," she said to the man on the witness stand, "do you recall the exact time you detained my client?" Around 8:15, he replied. "Are you sure?" she asked, flipping a page. "Because according to the timestamp on your body cam footage," she clicked a button on the screen, "you didn't arrive at the scene until 8:49. Care to explain the time travel?" The officer fumbled. It must be a mix-up. Or, she said, staring him down, you lied on your report. The courtroom gasped. One by one, Aaliyah picked apart every piece of so-called evidence. The security footage? Blurry and inconclusive. The eyewitnesses? Both had been over 60 feet away and contradicted each other. Her final blow came when she introduced evidence that had been overlooked. GPS logs proving her client had been at a gas station a full 10 minutes away when the alleged crime occurred. By the end of the defense's case, the prosecutor looked like he'd been hit by a truck. The judge called a recess. When the court reconvened, he delivered his verdict with a tight jaw. Given the compelling evidence and the legal violations brought to light, the court finds the defendant not guilty. The room erupted. Aaliyah didn't smile. She simply closed her briefcase and nodded at her client, who was now in tears. The judge cleared his throat and looked down at her. Miss Carter, I owe you an apology. I judged you before you spoke. That won't happen again. She nodded respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed. Who is she? How old is she? Is she even real? But Aaliyah Carter didn't stay to answer questions. She wasn't in it for fame. She was in it for justice. She walked calmly down the courthouse steps, her mother waiting with open arms at the bottom. Aaliyah hugged her briefly, then turned to walk away, her head held high. This moment would become viral. Millions watched the video online, first laughing, then gasping, then cheering. But for Aaliyah, it was just another step in a life devoted to changing how the world sees young black brilliance. She had turned a courtroom full of skeptics into silent admirers. She had brought truth to light in the face of arrogance. And most importantly, she had reminded everyone watching that greatness doesn't ask for permission. It proves itself, no matter who tries to deny it. And in a world too quick to judge based on appearance, Aaliyah Carter's quiet strength, relentless preparation, and undeniable genius delivered a message more powerful than any speech. Never underestimate someone just because of their age or the color of their skin. Because one day, the very person you laughed at may be the one who changes your life or saves it. Justice doesn't come in a package society expects. Sometimes it comes wrapped in youthful confidence, armed with truth and dressed in a black suit that's just the right fit. The courtroom was alive with murmurs, skepticism hanging in the air like a fog as a young black teenager in a tailored black blazer walked confidently to the defense table. She looked no older than 17. Far too young, the crowd whispered, to be standing where seasoned lawyers usually stood. The judge raised an eyebrow, barely suppressing a chuckle. Is this some kind of mock trial? He asked dryly, prompting laughter to ripple through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor smirked, his body language dripping with arrogance. He leaned toward a colleague and muttered something inaudible, likely a joke at the teenager's expense. Yet she didn't flinch. Her name was Aaliyah Carter, and though everyone in the room viewed her as a misplaced child, she was about to reveal a truth that would shake their assumptions to the core. What they didn't know was that Aaliyah wasn't just a teenager with a passion for law. She was a certified prodigy. She'd graduated high school by 13, law school by 16, and had passed the bar with one of the highest scores in the state. Thanks to a rare legal program designed for intellectual prodigies under state supervision, she was fully licensed to practice law. And she had chosen her first public case not for fame, but because she saw an injustice that no one else cared enough to fix. Her client, a young black man named Marcus Hill, was accused of stealing from a local electronics store. The evidence appeared overwhelming. Grainy security footage, 2 eyewitnesses, and a signed arrest report. The prosecution believed this would be an easy win. Aaliyah, however, had spent countless hours examining every detail, turning over every stone, and assembling a defense that no one expected from someone her age. As the prosecutor began his opening remarks, Confidently painting Marcus as a repeat offender, Aaliyah sat quietly, taking notes. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't waste time. She rose calmly, approached the bench, and began her statement. Your Honor, I move to dismiss the charges on the grounds that the arrest violated constitutional procedure under Section 48B of the State Penal Code. The room went silent. The judge squinted at her, confused. Explain yourself, he said, still in disbelief. What followed in the next 15 minutes would be remembered by everyone in that courtroom for the rest of their lives. With precise articulation and unwavering confidence, Aaliyah dissected the case piece by piece. First, she pointed out that the arrest report had been misfiled. The officer had recorded the wrong date, which meant the timeline of events didn't match up. Second, she revealed that the eyewitnesses had been over 60 feet away and gave two different descriptions of the suspect, one saying he wore a red hoodie, the other a blue jacket. Third, and most crucially, she introduced evidence the prosecution had entirely overlooked. Verified GPS logs from Marcus's phone showing that he had been at a gas station over 5 miles away at the exact time of the alleged theft. She didn't yell. She didn't perform. She simply let the truth speak louder than anything else in the room. As she moved through her argument, even the prosecutor's smug expression began to melt. He fumbled through his papers, unable to refute, the airtight facts being laid before the court. The once dismissive judge leaned forward, clearly stunned. You're telling me, he said slowly, that this young man was arrested based on flawed paperwork, conflicting testimony, and outdated footage that doesn't even clearly show his face? Aaliyah nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And with that, I rest my case. There was no sound, not a cough, not a whisper, just silence. Even those who had laughed at her earlier were now staring in disbelief. The judge looked at the prosecutor, who had no rebuttal. His mouth opened, then closed. Red-faced, he sat down without saying a word. After a long pause, the judge cleared his throat. Given the compelling evidence and the legal violations highlighted by the defense, this court finds the defendant not guilty. Cheers didn't erupt. Instead, what followed was a stunned silence, and then, slowly, quiet applause that built into a standing ovation, not for the judge, not for the prosecution, but for Aaliyah Carter. The same people who mocked her now stood in awe. The judge looked down at her with a changed tone. Miss Carter, he said sincerely, I owe you an apology. I underestimated you, and I won't make that mistake again. Aaliyah nodded respectfully, not basking in the praise, but simply accepting that justice had been served. Outside the courtroom, reporters flooded the steps. Microphones, cameras, flashing lights, all aimed at the girl who had defied every expectation. But Aaliyah didn't linger. She gave a brief statement, thanking her mentors and her mother, and reminding everyone that Marcus's story was one of many. There are countless people who get trapped in the system, she said. This isn't just about proving myself, it's about fixing what's broken. And with that, she walked down the steps beside Marcus, who hugged her with tears in his eyes. You saved my life, he whispered. No, she replied. I just gave it back. That night, the story went viral. The headline read, Teen lawyer stuns courtroom, frees innocent man in 15 minutes. Social media erupted with admiration, debates, and inspiration. Many questioned how the system had allowed a young girl to do what full-grown adults couldn't. Others praised her as a symbol of hope, resilience, and brilliance. For Aaliyah, it was just the beginning. She returned home, opened her laptop, and continued working on her next case. She didn't crave the spotlight. Her only desire was to shine that light on injustice wherever it hid. In a society that often values appearances over substance, Aaliyah Carter proved that true strength doesn't roar. It stands its ground. She reminded the world that genius can come in many forms, and that justice is not reserved for the old, the experienced, or the powerful. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a young girl in a courtroom full of doubters, armed not with age, but with truth, courage, and a mind sharper than anyone could predict. That day, karma didn't just catch up. It showed up in the form of a teenage genius who refused to let ignorance win, and the world would never forget her name. In a courtroom wrapped in the solemn warmth of oak paneling and quiet judgment, a wave of murmurs swept across the room as a young black girl stepped forward. She couldn't have been older than 17, dressed sharply in a tailored blazer and slacks, her face calm but eyes burning with intensity. Her name was Aaliyah Carter, and from the moment she entered the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted, though not in her favor. The judge, an elderly white man with a slow, almost amused manner, adjusted his glasses and smirked. "Miss, this is a courtroom, not a classroom. Are you lost?" His tone wasn't angry. It was patronizing, laced with disbelief and amusement. Laughter echoed softly from the gallery. Even the court clerk chuckled under his breath, and the bailiff looked away, hiding a grin. The opposing counsel, a seasoned prosecutor in his 50s, leaned back smugly, clearly expecting a short trial, confident that whatever this girl was doing here, it wouldn't last long. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. She stood straighter, holding a stack of documents nearly as thick as her arm, and walked firmly to the defense table where her client, a young man named Marcus Hill, sat with handcuffs still on. Marcus looked confused. He'd expected a lawyer, not a teenager. "Don't worry," Aaliyah whispered. "I've got this." Marcus didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just a kid with a law book. She was a certified genius. She had completed high school at 13, graduated from an accelerated law program by 16, and passed the bar just before turning 17. Under a little-known provision in her state's legal code, Aaliyah had the right to practice law after passing all required tests and undergoing extensive mentorship. She had chosen this case not for headlines, but because she believed in justice for people the world had stopped believing in. The judge, barely hiding his skepticism, asked again, "You're really representing Mr. Hill today?" Aaliyah nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Very well," he sighed. "Let's see how this goes." The prosecution began confidently. They painted Marcus as a petty criminal caught red-handed stealing from a downtown electronics store. Grainy security footage, inconsistent eyewitness statements, and a sloppy arrest report seemed more than enough. The prosecutor leaned into his narrative with flair, knowing he had the advantage. When he finished, he looked over at Aaliyah with a smirk that said, "Your turn, kid." She rose slowly, walked to the center of the room, and with a calm that silenced even the quiet snickering in the back, began to speak. "Your Honor," she said, "this case is not what it appears to be. I move for immediate dismissal based on violations of constitutional procedure." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." With precision, Aaliyah dismantled the prosecution's case. First, she pointed out that the date on the arrest report was incorrect, a critical detail that undermined the timeline. Second, she introduced evidence that neither the police nor prosecution had considered. Verified GPS data showing Marcus's phone location at a gas station miles away at the time of the alleged crime. She also revealed a time-stamped receipt and surveillance images placing Marcus clearly at the gas station when the theft occurred. Her voice never shook. She was methodical, eloquent, and calm, as if she'd done this 100 times before. Then came the final blow. Aaliyah played an audio clip, a phone call between one of the eyewitnesses and the police dispatcher, where the witness said they weren't sure what they saw because the street was too dark and the person ran too fast. The voice on the tape literally said, "I think it was a black guy, but I'm not sure." The courtroom grew still. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, no longer amused. The prosecutor tried to object, but his voice cracked. His confidence drained as he fumbled through papers, unable to refute the facts she laid bare. When Aaliyah finally rested her case, she simply said, "The law must protect the innocent. That's its purpose. If we ignore the truth, we betray everything this court stands for." There was a beat of silence. The judge looked over his glasses, staring at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. "Miss Carter," he said, slowly, his voice softer now. "You've exceeded my expectations." He turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have any rebuttal?" The man shook his head, humiliated. The judge nodded solemnly, then turned to the room. Given the clear contradictions in the prosecution's case, the new evidence presented, and the strong defense provided, I find the defendant not guilty. The gavel struck. The courtroom didn't erupt in cheers, but something more powerful happened. Applause broke out. Not raucous, not chaotic, but a slow, building wave of respect. People stood one by one. Even those who had laughed earlier now clapped in awe. The clerk, the same one who had chuckled earlier, leaned to a colleague and whispered, "She's a legend." The judge leaned forward and in a low, respectful tone said, "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology. I underestimated you, and that was my mistake." Aaliyah didn't smile. She nodded quietly, emotions tight in her chest. Marcus, now unshackled, rushed to her and hugged her tightly, tears pouring down his cheeks. "You saved me," he sobbed. "I just told the truth," she replied, hugging him back. Outside the courtroom, the press was already waiting. Reporters shoved microphones toward her, shouting questions. "Who is she? Is she even licensed? How did she learn the law like that?" But Aaliyah just gave a calm, brief statement. "Justice isn't about age, and it's not about status. It's about truth. That's why I'm here." And with that, she walked down the courthouse steps with Marcus by her side. By that evening, her story had gone viral. Headlines read, "Teen Prodigy Destroys Prosecutor in Stunning Legal Victory." Social media lit up with clips of her closing argument, analysis of her credentials, and discussions about the flaws in the justice system. Some praised her as a symbol of change, of hope, of rising against systemic bias. Others debated whether someone so young should be in the courtroom, but no one doubted her intelligence, her impact, or the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Aaliyah didn't bask in the fame. That same night, while the internet buzzed, she sat at her desk reviewing case files for another client, a woman wrongfully accused of welfare fraud. Her mother peeked into the room and said, "You've already changed lives, baby." Aaliyah replied softly, "It's just one case. There are thousands more who need someone to believe in them." And that was Aaliyah Carter. She didn't just defend the law, she resurrected belief in its potential. In a world that laughed at her because of her age, her skin color, her gender, she made them all stand. She didn't raise her voice, she raised the standard. In that quiet courtroom, in front of those who doubted her, she reminded them all, never underestimate the power of truth or the girl who wields it without fear. In a small courtroom tucked within the heart of a bustling city, the air was thick with tension, anticipation, and quiet judgment. It was one of those ordinary mornings that would soon become unforgettable. Spectators filled the wooden benches, murmuring softly, exchanging glances, waiting for the trial to begin. No one paid much attention when the defense attorney entered, mainly because they didn't expect her. Aaliyah Carter, a 17-year-old black girl with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes, walked into the room wearing a tailored navy blazer, holding a stack of neatly arranged legal documents. Her natural curls were pulled back professionally, and her every movement spoke of quiet confidence. But her age stood out. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. The elderly judge, seated in his high-backed leather chair, chuckled lightly, assuming she was a paralegal or perhaps a family member of the accused. "Miss, are you in the right place?" he asked, half joking, half serious, glancing over his reading glasses. Laughter erupted softly among the spectators. Even the court clerk raised an amused eyebrow, and the bailiff exchanged a smirk with the prosecutor. The opposing counsel, a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit, didn't even bother masking his amusement. He leaned back with folded arms, convinced that this would be a quick win, but Aaliyah didn't flinch. She stood tall, calm, but assertive. "Yes, Your Honor," she said evenly. "I'm representing the defendant today. My name is Aaliyah Carter, licensed attorney under state law, and I'm ready to proceed." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The judge blinked, then cleared his throat, clearly caught off guard. "Well, all right then. Let's see what you've got." The case at hand involved a young man named Marcus Hill, wrongfully accused of burglary after being allegedly caught on security camera near an electronics store. The evidence was shaky at best, but the prosecution was confident in its narrative. Marcus, a 22-year-old mechanic, had a prior misdemeanor and a skin color that made him an easy target in a system all too familiar with unfair assumptions. Aaliyah had taken the case pro bono. It wasn't about publicity or headlines. It was about justice, something she had studied, devoured, and mastered since she was a child. She'd been a prodigy from the start. Graduated high school at 13, finished law school by 16, passed the bar before turning 17. Many doubted her, but the law didn't lie, and neither did the truth. As the trial began, the prosecutor started with confidence. He painted Marcus as a repeat offender caught red-handed. He pointed to grainy footage showing a hooded figure outside the store and presented vague witness testimonies. His tone was smug, his words polished. But when it came time for the defense, the courtroom braced itself for awkward stuttering, for inexperience, for failure. What they got instead was a masterclass. Aaliyah began by calmly challenging the timeline. She cross-examined the officer who made the arrest and revealed glaring contradictions in his report. Next, she introduced GPS tracking data from Marcus's phone, which placed him miles away at the time of the alleged burglary. She held up a time-stamped receipt from a gas station, accompanied by surveillance footage that clearly showed Marcus filling his tank and chatting with the cashier during the incident. Her delivery was sharp, deliberate, respectful, but commanding. Every word cut through the doubt that had filled the courtroom. Then came the audio recording, one the prosecution had overlooked. A 911 call from the supposed eyewitness who admitted they couldn't really identify the suspect. "It was dark," the voice on the recording said. "I think it was a black guy, but I'm not sure." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge leaned forward, his expression no longer playful, but grave. The prosecutor stood frozen, his earlier smirk replaced by a pale realization. Aaliyah turned and looked at him directly. "This isn't about opinion or assumption. This is about facts. And the facts prove my client's innocence." With that, she returned to her seat. There was no need for dramatics. The truth had already spoken loud enough. The judge was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at the case files, then up at Marcus, and finally at Aaliyah. "This court finds the defendant, Marcus Hill, not guilty of all charges." His gavel struck the bench with a final thud. It was done. At first, there was just silence. And then, applause. Not wild, not chaotic, but slow, respectful, and growing. People stood recognizing what had just happened. The same people who had laughed when Aaliyah entered now clapped in stunned admiration. Even the court clerk wiped his eyes discreetly. The bailiff nodded once in deep respect. The prosecutor gathered his things without a word. The judge looked at Aaliyah and said, with genuine humility, "Miss Carter, you've given this courtroom a lesson it won't soon forget." Marcus turned to her, overwhelmed with emotion. You believed in me when no one else did, he whispered. She smiled gently. You just needed someone to say it out loud. Outside, cameras and reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Her story had already begun to spread online. Clips of her closing arguments, screenshots of court transcripts, headlines screaming, "Teen attorney shocks courtroom in viral victory." But Aaliyah didn't care for the spotlight. She gave a short statement. Simple, powerful. Justice isn't about age, it isn't about race, it's about truth. And when you speak it boldly, it doesn't matter who doubts you. Then she walked away, not toward fame, but toward her next case. That evening, while the world buzzed about her, she sat at her desk again, papers spread out, another client's life in her hands. Her mother entered the room and said, "You're a force, baby. You changed something today." Aaliyah nodded, softly. One person at a time. She didn't just win a case. She broke every assumption tied to her age, gender, and skin color. She reminded the world that brilliance doesn't ask for permission. It steps in, it speaks up, and it rewrites the narrative. Aaliyah Carter wasn't loud. She didn't boast. She didn't need to. Her presence, her preparation, and her passion did the speaking. And everyone listened. Because in that courtroom, she didn't just defend a man's innocence. She defended the belief that no one should be underestimated, that truth matters, that greatness can come wrapped in unexpected forms, and that sometimes the quietest voice can carry the most powerful verdict. So the next time someone laughs at you, doubts you, dismisses you because of how you look or how young you are, remember Aaliyah. Remember that she walked into a courtroom full of smirks and left it with standing ovations, because greatness doesn't need permission. It just needs a chance. And she took it. So let them laugh, let them doubt. You'll be the one with the last word.